What is going on, mere mortals? My name is John Solo, and God of War Ragnarok is a game about family trauma. It's also about ripping your enemy's limbs off with your bare hands, but the family trauma theme is worth exploring, because the writers at Santa Monica Studios used the most epic source material in existence, the Norse myth about the end of the world, to explore some of the most personal pains that humans can endure, or not endure in Baldur's case.
I can't feel any of this.
When we meet Thor's daughter, Thrud Thorsdottir, we learn right away that she doesn't have the ideal relationship with either of her parents. Her mother is overprotective after her sons were killed by Kratos, and her father is too busy seeking approval from his own father and wallowing in his personal pit of despair to give her the love and encouragement she needs. In my opinion, Thrud was one of the more interesting characters the game introduced, not only because of the perspective she gave us into what it would be like being born into a family of overachieving all-powerful gods, but also because her role in real Norse myth is smaller. Much smaller. If you take a look at our two most important resources for Norse mythology, the Prose Edda and Poetic Edda, Thor's daughter only appears in one poem. It's a pretty hilarious one, but I'm sad to say, it doesn't teach us much about her. The poem is called Alvismal, which literally translates to the words of Allwise. Allwise is the name of a dwarf that shows up at Thor's house one day with the intention of taking his daughter's hand in marriage. As you would imagine, Thor isn't down with the idea of this stranger from another land whisking his daughter away to his underground estate, and he makes that point very clear. But instead of outright crushing Allwise's skull with his hammer and just ending it there, he decides to toy with the dwarf and put his wisdom to the test. The line reads, "This girl's love will never be yours, my clever guest, if you dare to leave this house without telling me what I want to know about every realm. Tell me, Allwise, since I think you know everything about everyone, dwarf, what is the earth called that people walk on in every world?" Then Allwise quickly responds with the correct answers. Men call it earth, the Aesir call it soil, the Vanir call it road, giants call it green, elves call it grower, high gods call it clay. The conversation follows this pattern of Thor asking questions and Allwise giving various terms the realms use for the sky, the sun, the moon, the clouds, the wind, when the wind stands still, the sea, fire, the woods, night, grain, and ale. Some of the epithets are kind of wild. Apparently the Vanir call the woods wands, and dwarves call night the queen of dreams. But for the most part, this poem feels like a thesaurus with a frame story. I do love the ending though. After Allwise has answered all of Thor's questions, the Thunder God reveals that while he finds Allwise's knowledge impressive, he was really just stalling for time. The sun had risen and begun to pour in through the windows, and the overconfident dwarf was turned to stone. Now, if you're a fan of Lord of the Rings, that ending might sound familiar, because that's very similar to how Gandalf fooled the trolls Bert, Ted, and William into arguing until the sun rose and they were turned to stone. We know for a fact that Tolkien borrowed archetypes, creatures, and even names from Norse mythology. Several of the dwarves in The Hobbit were named directly after dwarves listed in the Prose Edda, but Tolkien himself never confirmed that this poem and that chapter are connected. It wouldn't surprise me though. Anyway, we learned a few things about Thor's daughter here. In the first few stanzas, Thor describes her as a goddess, which is kind of obvious, but you never know how children of deities are going to be ranked. And Allwise calls her beautiful, as lovely as snow, which has me thinking that she's pale. Back in the day, being pale was seen as a very attractive trait because it showed that someone was rich enough to not have to work outdoors. There is a catch to this knowledge of the beautiful pale goddess though. The poem doesn't actually tell us which daughter of Thor it's talking about. As far as we know, he only has the one, but the poem never explicitly states her name, which is Thruther, by the way. Thruther translates to strength, so her portrayal in God of War as being roughly 10 times as strong as Atreus is probably accurate. But the point is that while we're pretty sure this poem was about Thruther, we can't say for certain, and the couple of other occasions she's mentioned in the Old Norse texts give us no other details to work with. It's just a few poems and myths where Thor is referred to as Thruther's father. There does appear to be a long-lost story about her though. In a poem called Ragnar's Drapa, the Jotun named Hrungnir is referred to as Thief of Thruther, implying that he may have abducted her at one point. It'd be pretty fitting since that guy ends up being the first giant that Thor ever kills in a one-on-one duel, but in the story where they fight, there's no mention of the sordid past with Thrud's kidnapping. Hrungnir just gets drunk and overconfident, and Thor makes him pay for it by embedding his hammer into his skull. So at this point you're probably wondering, if Thrud barely has any significance in Norse mythology, why include her in God of War's story? And was there anything besides her name that's accurate to the mythos? The answers to those questions are where things get really interesting. The world of Norse mythology is vast, and there are an infinite number of approaches that the developers could have taken with God of War's plot. But they wanted to tell a story about the many mistakes that parents make with their children and how their children cope with those mistakes. We saw how Freya's overprotectiveness drove her son Baldur to insanity. There was a strain on Kratos and Atreus' relationship when Kratos couldn't trust the boy to make his own decisions. And then there's Thor Odinson's family. Talk about a perfect group of characters to use as your canvas. There's plenty of mythology about Thor and Odin to work with, but there's almost nothing written about Thor's children, as we've established today and on my episode about Magni and Modi. At first, that might sound like a problem, but in reality, these characters were blank canvases that allowed the writers to get real creative and specific with their personalities and the struggles that each one faced. Magni is not a good example because he was just the fucking man. The big bad older brother who could beat up anybody and look good while doing it. He didn't really have any faults or weaknesses, except his face wasn't axe-proof. Modi had issues out the wazoo. He was constantly comparing himself to Magni, as was everybody else, and he desperately sought his father's approval, similar to how Thor clearly wanted Odin's approval.
You ruined everything. I earned that fucking hammer. But now, everyone's gonna think I only got it because Magni's gone.
And then there's Thrud. We know from our eavesdropping that Sif and Thor don't want to make the same mistakes with her that they did with Magni and Modi and lose her to Odin's relentless pursuit of goals that only benefit himself. As a result, Thrud feels like her parents are holding her back from reaching her full potential and accomplishing her dream of becoming a Valkyrie. A dream that I think has its roots in the real mythology, because both the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda mention a Valkyrie named Thrud who serves ale to the fallen warriors in Valhalla. Once again, we can't be 100% sure that Valkyrie Thrud is indeed Thor's daughter because it doesn't explicitly say, and the Eddas like to use the same names for multiple characters, which is really fun, but it's totally possible that they really are the same Thrud. Either way, I think that Thrud wanting to be a Valkyrie is a really clever tie-in to her possible role in the mythology. I'm also really curious to see what they do with her character in the next game, because after Ragnarok, you can see her in Alfheim as she takes a vow to make her father proud, then flies off with his hammer, Mjolnir. If she does go on to train with Sigrun, the Valkyrie Queen, like Freya said she might, let's just say that I hope our days of fighting Valkyries are over. I don't need to go and rip Thrud's wings off, okay? I'm not trying to be like the husbands in the Swan Maiden stories we talked about last week. But listen up, mere mortals. If you enjoyed learning about the real mythology behind Thrud, I've done some very similar deep dives on the majority of characters in God of War. Mimir and Baldur are two of my personal favorites, but if you're more interested in Jormungandr or Hel, feel free to check those out. In the meantime, if this video taught you something, or at the very least entertained you, consider dropping a like and subscribing for more content where I explain mythology and folklore on a weekly basis. And you'll get to see this guy, which is cool. Also consider following Messed Up Origins on Twitter and Instagram because the sub box barely works nowadays and it's nice to have a backup way of being notified when I upload. I've also started posting shorts to our social media accounts so you'll get some bonus content there too. I'll see you all again next week when we dive back into the world of Greek mythology for the first time in way too long. Until then, my name is John Solo and don't forget, John shot first.